Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Jewish Professionals Podcast, the JP Podcast. I'm Hillel Bainach.
And I'm Benjamin Winters, and we're students at Yeshiva University, just looking for some advice.
Our aim is to bring to you Jewish professionals from every industry to learn from their successes and failures, how they grew in their career and Jewish identity, and made a Kiddush Hashem along the way.
We hope you can apply what you learned through the lessons to your own life as they pass the torch to us, the next generation. We can't wait to go along this journey with you. This is the Jewish Professionals Podcast.
Woo! Welcome back, everybody, to the JP Podcast, the Jewish Professionals Podcast. Coming up on Pesach, Ben. It's an exciting time.
I know, and you're getting ready for Pesach. You're cleaning your house. The Schwitz starts. You get your Mishloach Manot. You have a race to finish them. Every kid who's in middle school is like in heaven, but when you get older and you realize your parents, you're like, how am I going to get rid of all these things? Not that I'm a parent, but just within my dorm room.
If you need help eating them, I can always come in. But a big staple of Pesach is the wine, really.
Is the wine? What wine specifically do you like to drink?
I mean, there's Rashi, there's definitely Manischewitz.
I'm a big Manischewitz guy.
Big Manischewitz. And I know our guest today actually did some work with them. So we're excited to get into that. And
I was wondering where this was going. I thought maybe they were a sponsor.
Oh, listen, well, Manischewitz, you're looking for a sponsor. I mean, we're open. But to introduce, we have Josh Schwartz. And Ben, maybe take us through some of his accolades.
Yeah, Josh is a seasoned investment banker. He's an entrepreneur and advisor in media, entertainment, and education sectors. Josh actually started, he went to Colgate, he then got his law degree, and he worked at Skadden and then Bear Stearns, and now started his own firm at Eastwind Advisors. Is that right, Josh?
Well done.
Is there anything I missed?
Call it Skadden.
Skadden.
Oh,
Skadden.
I hate to see that.
It's the Maryland accent, I guess.
Well, I don't think that's a thing. Thank you for coming in, Josh.
My pleasure to be here.
Well, did Colgate make the tournament this year? I don't think
Colgate
so.
did not.
They usually do.
Were they
had
good?
a good run.
Were they good back in your day?
They were not good in my day in basketball. They were very good in football, and for a small school with less than an enrollment of 3,000, played serious D1 football. The first weekend that I was up there, they played Penn State away and got trounced, but they were competitive. But they, over the years, developed a good basketball team. And at some point, maybe 10 years after I graduated, had a player, Donald Foyle, who ended up getting drafted.
Wow.
Played in the NBA for a few years.
Did you ever think about going out for the team?
All the time. We can think whatever we want.
What position?
So actually, I'd say I was a jock in high school, but didn't translate into a college career. I hung up my sneakers.
Hung up the sneakers. I like that. Well, I'll also say that about Colgate. It's interesting because when you go to school at Penn State, their stands are packed with like tens of thousands of people, and you guys have 3,000 people in your school. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, but it's just got this interesting tradition where sports is really important. I would say hockey consistently has been the mainstay for the sports program. My freshman year roommate and to this day closest friend was a football player, a linebacker for Colgate. So, it's a small school, but I think because of that size, the athletes and the students are, very close, and there's not as much of a separation at a, big school where, especially these days, the athletes are, they're celebrities.
Right, for sure. Now they're getting paid too.
Yeah, the NIL and everything. So take us back to Colgate a little bit.
Well, even before Colgate, like just growing up, how did you get there to start and your childhood experiences?
All right, so we're gonna go back to the beginning. So I grew up born in Mount Sinai, Manhattan. Grew up in Westchester County. First 11 years in New Rochelle, but on the other side of the tracks, not the Waigagil area that your audience is probably very familiar with. There was a racial riot when I was in fourth grade across the street in the middle school, Isaac Young. And so my parents picked their heads up and moved up the Boston Post Road to the border of Ryan Mamaroneck. And I ended up doing the last 7 years in the public school system in Mamaroneck. And then 4 minutes after I graduated, my parents, who were from Manhattan, when I was living in Manhattan when I was conceived, moved back to the city and moved back to Greenwich Village, where they had been living, and lived there right after I graduated from high school. So from 18 and up, I was back in the city. I was not a particularly good student. As I said, I was more of a jock than a serious student. But being an athlete paid off for me, because I had a 10th grade English professor who was also my JV football coach.
Oh.
And he took an interest in me and saw something that wasn't easily seen by others, just because I wasn't a serious student. And he went to Colgate, and he encouraged me in a lot of different ways to apply, and I think explained me to them. And, and that's how I got into Colgate. I was interested in Colgate because I think a year or two before I graduated, they went undefeated in football, and they had I remember a very good fullback, and they had a history of some great players. I think Mark Van Egan, who was Oakland Raiders fullback, also went to Colgate. And when I did the college tour and went up to see it, it was snowing the night that I was there, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. And I decided I wanted to go there. So my wife always says, I've never met anyone who graduated from Colgate who didn't love it. And it's a very special place.
Your wife also went to Colgate?
My wife did not go to Colgate. She went to NYU, she went to FIT. Later in life, she went to Columbia. She has a little bit more of a winding academic path.
Okay, interesting. So you get to Colgate, and you're kind of interested in that, in the sports and that, the extracurriculars. Do you ever hone down and be like, I'm going to take my academics very seriously now?
Yeah, I broke my wrist in my senior year playing football, which prevented me from playing basketball, which was also my passion. And so by the time I decided that I was going to go to Colgate, I got a couple of letters actually from college, recruiting letters from college, mostly because I played with somebody who was all-state and ended up getting a scholarship to UConn.
Wow.
And so everybody was looking at his film. At those days, it wasn't digital. It was literally...
And they were like, who's that good point guard?
Who's that other guy over there?
No, well, it was actually football, not basketball, because I didn't play my senior year. And, I made maybe a couple good blocks or a tackle, and so that generated a couple letters. But I just knew I'm not going to play in the pros. I had this broken wrist, which actually never healed and came back to haunt me many years later. So as I said, I hung up my cleats and just decided, sports for me would be a hobby. But as I said, I went in there and I wasn't a great student, so I really had to get up to speed. But for me at the time, the main event being there, obviously social life, but also academic. So I really had a steep learning curve as I transitioned from, being a jock, not interested in academics, to really focusing in on academics.
Right. Not only that, but you went from jock to philosophy major.
Yes.
At Colgate.
You don't see that very often.
Talk about the pendulum. What got you interested in that?
So what I'm describing on my background, I think, suggests perhaps I didn't grow up from birth, although my kids have. So there wasn't a significant Jewish life at Colgate at the time. Much better now. But in my freshman year, Colgate had required courses, and one of them was philosophy and religion. And believe it or not, the class that I took was taught by a nun. And the first section of the class was the New Testament. I really, it sparked an interest for me in philosophy and religious, really triggered by the New Testament. I didn't have much of a Jewish background at the time.
However you get it done, I guess.
Yeah, and so as a result of that, we ultimately went on to other topics that were more relevant to me. But I got curious, and so I started taking philosophy classes, and next thing you know, got exposed to existentialism and became a philosophy major. I think I had a minor in poli-sci. I thought I was going to be. One thing I should say about myself is my father, who's no longer with us, but was a legendary lawyer. Had a very strong personality. If you met him today, he would try to convince you to go to law school. He thought everybody should go to law school, so I never had a choice. I knew I was going to law school, but so I thought I would, they didn't have a pre-law major or concentration, so poli-sci was natural. And I enjoyed poli-sci, but philosophy just trumped it. So I ended up majoring in philosophy.
Yeah, I'm a son of a lawyer too.
Yeah.
And the law school push is, I wouldn't say it's exactly, maybe not that hard, but I guess it's natural. It's in the oxygen.
Well, I've known a lot of lawyers that actually tell me you should never go to law school. I don't know. Maybe it's a mix.
Yeah, I have a theory about it. I'll tell you about it later. But I would say at that time, a lot of young people with my background and profile went to law school as a default. And there really weren't as many career options then as you have now. Like, computer science was just becoming a thing. And so you just had a lot more people, from my demographic background going to law school. I know law school enrollments are actually up recently,
Right.
but there had been sort of a flattening, if not downward trend for a while. And look, it's a great education, but it's incredibly expensive. And unless you go to a top school, it's harder and harder to get a job. So I think there are a lot of people out there that are just, trying to make ends meet, and it's hard to find your pathway, and unless you're recruited by one of the top firms, and then you have options. But I don't regret it at all, and in a lot of ways, it was like an instrumental point of departure for my career.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you worked very hard in rel sats, and you, or not so much.
As I said, I wasn't a student, and it was an evolution. So I was evolving into it. But no, I took them very seriously. I, didn't get into the best option, but I ended up going to BU. So I majored in philosophy. I ended up graduating with honors in philosophy. Philosophy it's a great precursor to a legal education because it requires a lot of close reading and analysis and a lot of reading. And so it was actually a great stepping stone for law. I got into law school and left the city, went to Boston for 3 years, and I'm anticipating your next set of questions. I did well enough in my first summer. After my first year, I had an internship at the Manhattan DA's office. I was actually interviewed by a person who ended up becoming the Manhattan DA, Cyrus Vance. Still have the letter of acceptance from him. And so I worked at the DA's office. And again, my father was more of a generalist, but a litigator. I accepted his direction to go to law school, but I didn't think that I wanted to work in the family business. So I took a immediate turn exploring criminal law and prosecution, and it was a great job to have over that summer. But I did well enough in my first year to have the opportunity to work for a big corporate law firm in my second summer, and a couple different firms that I could have chose from, but I ended up working at Skadden as a summer intern that second year, right. And then went back to them and started my career at Skadden.
They say that first year of law school is the most important, hardest, and then after that you're just coasting. How does that?
I think that's generally correct, at least back in my day, which was a while ago. I think so much is determined by that first year, and it's not everything, but if you excel in your first year, you get a certain set of options for the summer in your second year. And in a lot of ways, that predetermines, at least the fate of the first chapter of your career. And, I was thinking about what you might want to talk about, and also spend some time listening to your interview with Dean Strauss. And, he's a good friend of mine, and I've always admired him, but I wasn't intimately familiar with his story, and it's remarkable and exceptional how he really, made himself out from, it's just a classic story. But so much of what he was saying to you guys about like how you may try and plan, and then things end up being presented to you that you never expected. Man plans, God laughs. Like there was so much in what he was saying that I think is true for me as well.
So you go into big law, and this is your first time where the pressure is really on, right? Since football, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's pressure along the way, but it's just a different environment and a really interesting time where, Skadden's was known as one of the firms that really created the hostile takeover market, and which you don't see as much anymore. But hostile takeovers, leveraged buyouts, takeovers before there was a real thing as private equity. And you had these like larger than life corporate raiders, backed by Michael Milken, companies figuring out how to protect themselves from these hostile takeovers and implementing poison pills. Like all of this was, happening around the time that I joined the firm. So it was very exciting. Like not everybody, I think, is excited by that type of thing. But, for people like me, I went in and my head was absolutely spinning.
Right. It's like the Super Bowl every single day in work.
Yeah. I mean, I was there. There was a book about the takeover of Nabisco, Barbarians at the Gate. And that was like literally happening, I think, on the 35th floor of 919 3rd Avenue at that time. And I wasn't involved in the transaction, but worked for people who were. And, it was just a buzz. And, strange things motivate people. When you see something that you're working on the front page of, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, it's interesting. So working at a place like Skadden, when I started after that summer, the summer was amazing there, and so I ended up going back and got staffed on a bailout of. I started in 1987. I think the first day I started, the market crashed. Black Monday, 508 points, which seems like
your first day.
Yeah.
Welcome to the big leagues.
Yeah. No, it's an eye opener, and I fortunately got the job before the country went into recession, and we had 2 years before things really took a turn. But, mindful of the fact that you can't control when you go into the workforce. And I've met a lot of young people, we'll probably get into this later, in recent years who unfortunately graduated when the market wasn't that robust. And it takes a lot of persistence and resilience to, if you really want to do it, to stick it out. And it works out for everybody. So I was fortunate that, that things kind of blew up early on, but we were all in our seats, and then I ended up getting to work on some transactions that were caused by the economic distress, and one of them was the bailout of First City Bancorp of Texas, which was bailed out by initially the FDIC, which wrote what at the time seemed like a really big check. I think it was like $900 million, and now it's a rounding error. And then they created a good bank, bad bank situation where they took all the underperforming loans. It was basically a securitization, structured finance, things, now that you see all the time. But it was a pretty exotic structure, and an investment bank called DLJ, Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette, which, was one of the great independent banks at the time, was involved in spearheading the transaction. And then ultimately, everybody needed Drexel Burnham to come in and raise the financing to create the resources for this transaction. So, I don't know, within a month of starting, the announcement of that transaction was literally on the front page of the New York Times. So, just as a young person, just like seeing what you're working on is newsworthy, that was pretty exciting. And then, that was a all-consuming transaction, couldn't work on anything else, ended up having to move to Houston, close to
Dallas.
Close to Dallas.
And living out of the Four Seasons Hotel for maybe a month, preparing for the closing of that. So like a lot of days just sitting around twiddling thumbs, but it was very exciting to work on a transaction that that was significant for the economy. And
you got to go to the best state in the world.
I don't know about that.
Everything was big there.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Everything's big.
It's actually so funny because people always ask me, they always think I'm from Houston. And I try to explain to them, they're like, Dallas, Houston's the same thing. I've never been to Houston in my life. It's a 4-hour drive. When am I going to do
I
that?
think that's on you.
Have you been to Boston?
I have. I was actually just there, yeah.
Okay. Also a 4-hour drive from here. Yeah, look, we don't take advantage of what's close at hand. So next time I see you, I want you to check that box.
You're going to get me a room in the Four Seasons?
For a month, yeah, a little.
We'll talk. I'll get you an Airbnb.
They have a pool. I'm a big fan of swimming these days.
Yeah.
But it seems like you did have some experience in criminal law, and then you go into this full-time position, and it seems like you really connect more with the business and the finance and the LBOs and the restructurings. Did that lead you to go eventually into the investment banking route?
Yeah. So I should say it was really helpful to me to have an experience. I just had a limited experience over the summer in criminal law and prosecution, and then this big corporate role as well, corporate law role. And so that was like the first career decision I had to make. Like, am I going to go down this path or that path? And, for whatever reason, I mean, I always often think back to what if I chose the other route? I would be, and I may be sitting here, but it wouldn't have been obvious how I got here. But no, I chose the corporate law path. My father was a litigator. I knew I didn't want to do that. If I had become a litigator, it would have been too easy for him to convince me to join him. Just kidding. But
Did he kick you out the house when you told him?
He was very, anybody who wanted to go to law school, he was very proud of. He talked my nephew went to go into law school, and my nephew is now on a very successful career path. But at the time, there were a lot of people who went into corporate law assuming that they would do it for 2 years and then go to an investment bank. I was not somebody who went in doing that. And to be honest, as I look back, like there wasn't a lot of like career self-reflection. Like, this is my plan. I'm going to do this and then that. I was a little bit more reactive. I was just happy to be there at that firm. A lot of exciting things were happening. And as I said, a couple years into it, the economy really took a turn for the worse in beginning in 1989. The first recession that I worked through, they seem to happen, every 7 to 10 years.
I was about to say.
And so, we ended up just doing some really menial work, just helping companies with 10K disclosure. And, when the economy turns bad, like a lot of, the tide rolls out and you see everybody who's like standing there, in their bathing suits or naked. And so there were a lot of shareholder lawsuits, and we were just like writing this disclosure. It was really, really soul crushing, and no deals to work on. And then one of the senior lawyers that I had worked with early on called me up and said, "How'd you like to work on a deal in Brazil?" And I said, "Sign me up." And I had not too long before that taken a vacation to Brazil and Argentina.
Wow.
And the idea of going back there, but for work, was very attractive. He said, it's actually it's a bank finance deal, not an M&A deal. And I said, well, I really don't know anything about bank finance. And he said, don't worry, we'll figure it out. And that was sort of the next seminal crossroads in my life. The work was to represent Bear Stearns in a bank transaction in Brazil, a dollar-denominated financing in Brazil when the economies in Latin America were starting to stabilize and interest rates were coming down, and the capital markets around the world, and in particular the U.S., were opening to Latin America and wanted to make investments and provide credit. And so Bear Stearns was acting as a placement agent for a bank in a fixed income U.S. denominated deal. Anyone in those economies that were able to raise dollar denominated, fixed income at much lower interest rates, were able to invest in those economies where interest rates were still, very high, and do incredibly well. So that started a string of work with Bear Stearns, and over the years, I was working almost exclusively for Bear Stearns. And as the stability started spreading to other countries and other industries, we went from working on bank deals, which was sort of like the lowest rung of the ladder of progress for these countries, to some privatization. So we represented some of the big agencies in Brazil, and then corporates and industry. And I ended up really focusing on two areas. One was media and entertainment. That was one of the sectors that was beginning to open for the international capital markets.
It's a little foreshadow.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's how I ended up doing it, and then I had an opportunity to work in the real estate area for a company called Brazil Realty and Sorella, and the founder of those businesses was a man named Ellie Horn, who is a very unique and special person who's, I think, well known in our community. And he had an amazing commercial real estate business, and we ended up helping him to raise equity and then bank financing. And he ended up investing all of that capital very wisely, and it took him to the next level. And so I really liked the media and entertainment sector, but the region then went back into this really volatile period. And Dean Strauss was talking about the Mexican peso devaluation.
Right.
It's a good story.
And I joined Bear in 94, and I think the Mexican, if we're talking about the same peso devaluation, probably was, they devalued, I think, at the end of 94. And the market just completely shut down in 95. There was nothing to do. And, Bear had invested a lot of resources into building this out. I should say, I skipped a step. I was at Skadden, and then at some point, Bear made me an offer. I was working...
Little poaches.
I was, effectively like their outside, exclusive lawyer. I was spending more time at 245 Park Avenue than 919 3rd. And then they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, which was to join them as a banker and give up the practice of law. And at that point, I was ready to do it.
Oh, how important is that you set a good standard of work? You never know when that could lead to your next job.
Yeah, I mean, the timing was for a variety of reasons. You always want to do excellent work and hold yourself to a high standard. And in this particular case, it paid off right around the time I was thinking, I think I need to start thinking about, a move. The person that I worked mostly for at Bear Stearns called me up and said, "What are your plans?" And I thought he was talking about like dinner plans that night. And I said, I'll probably go home and like order in. And he's like, no, your career plans. And within a couple of weeks, I gave notice and joined Bear. So it was kind of seamless because I knew them.
But it's a completely different industry. I guess you've been working with them, but it's a different side of the coin.
It's a different side, and that side, I spent enough time with them to realize that I enjoyed that. I'll tell you why in a second, but just to note, I was in the process of becoming a baal teshuvah and Shomer Shabbat when I was at Skadden, but it was very difficult, and it was particularly difficult because for, the years that I was there, I was a 24/7 guy, and I had gotten married, and we were starting to think about changing our lifestyles and becoming Shomer Shabbat. But it was very difficult to introduce that. When I had to that date been working in a particular way. When I decided to go to Bear, it was very easy, even though they knew me, because it was a break, to say, okay, now I'm gonna erase the whiteboard, and I'm going to create a new set of
boundaries.
parameters. Right. So I sat down with them and talked about it, and we should get into that.
I want to get into 24/7 guy. That's something, that a term you coined?
No, I don't think so. And I also didn't coin 24/6 guy. A client said to me, I tell people, you're my 24/6 banker. So that's more appropriate for today. We'll get into that as well. But, when you're in the service business, you're at the beck and call, and it is a challenge always to reach that work-life balance. But what I do want to say is, we're all working on the same transactions. So it is a natural transfer of skills from law to investment banking. I will say somebody who had made the transfer and then became very successful at Bear Stearns and was a senior M&A banker told me at one point, not everybody could do it. And a lot of lawyers become investment bankers, and they're still lawyers within the investment bank.
Right.
And that's not easy. So it takes a certain set of skills. And I think, for me, the best lawyers that I've worked with are ones who are trying to figure out how to say yes, not no. And saying yes. And so they're great lawyers, who are very commercial, who are thinking about how do we do this, but there are a number of them who are just like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And that type of lawyer, becoming an investment banker is going to have a more challenging situation because bankers need to figure out how to say yes. I mean, most bankers aren't charging by the hour. It's success-based, and you need to figure out how to achieve success in a transaction. So, but I think the skills, we all work on the same transactions. And as a banker with a legal background, I work hard to tell people, I'm not your lawyer. I'm not a practicing lawyer. Please don't ask me for legal advice. But it's helpful to know the concepts.
Could we go into that, or just a little backtrack to turning your lifestyle around, deciding to be from? Could you touch on that a little bit? What really sparked the change?
So you'll have to come to my Shabbat table to hear the full.
Is that an
story.
invite?
That's an invite.
That's an invite.
That's
I've
You
heard
guys,
of.
not your
Check.
audience, who I don't know, but you guys for sure. Absolutely. Love to have you guys. You know, I give a lot of credit to my wife, who's always led the charge. But, you know, as I learned more, as I mentioned, like I grew up with not a lot of background, but, you know, got more curious as I got more mature and, you know, wanted to understand my identity a little bit more. I was a philosophy major. And so I was interested in, you know, existential questions, theological questions. My wife had been going to Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald's beginner service at Lincoln Square. And
His son actually, or his grandson, Gav Buchwald, shout out to Gav Buchwald, is actually in YU.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure many Buchwalds have spent time in these halls. Anyway, he had a huge impact on our lives. So we started going together. We lived in the village, started coming up, and you know, just had a couple of real seminal experiences, including Rabbi Buchwald sending us to a Shabbat lunch. And I had not done that before, and I saw this family sitting around the table together without any distractions and friends popping by. And, you know, I was somebody who at the time, you know, was working pretty much 7 days a week. And just this idea that there was like a structural solution to that. You know, even if I wanted to work, I couldn't. Like a lot of people, you know, who work in these industries, you know, in the service industries, like you need to always be on call and move quickly. And especially in the deal business, like everything is about momentum. And so you need to always respond quickly, and you can't, like, it's just the nature of the business. And so this idea that even if I wanted to, if my instincts were telling me that's what I should do, like I can't. This 25-hour period is sacred. Like it just made a lot of sense.
Yeah, they say if you want to show a baal teshuvah or someone who's a potential baal teshuvah Judaism, you should show them Shabbos because
it's truly
most
magical.
impactful. Right?
Yeah, look, there are a number of things. I mean, bring somebody to a sukkah, and like, you know, as long as it's, you know, not in a courtyard with like, you know, a lot of things you wouldn't want to see.
Well, in Dallas, and so it's usually like 100 degrees. Everyone's in there sweating, and like if you don't have a fan in the sukkah,
yeah,
cooked.
well, you gotta figure that out. There's a hack for everything. So it made sense, but I would say it was definitely a process. I was in a lot of trips to Latin America. I was in Argentina when I decided that I wouldn't eat treif meat. And everybody eats meat in Argentina. I had to break the news to my colleagues, like I'm not going to that restaurant, or I'll have a salad.
Were they confused? Like,
Yeah,
what is
very
going on?
confused. But in general, a lot of respect in the journey. And you know, also another topic, you know, post October 7th, like you'd be surprised at how many calls I got from people who are not Jewish who said to me. One person in particular, hey, I know Israel is important to you, and you know, I think you have some family there. Maybe I just want to tell you, like, I know in these times, community is so important. I want you to consider me part of your community. And he was Indian descent.
That's special.
Yeah. So yeah, like I can't say grateful to Chabad because I have had to do a lot of traveling over the years, and I've got stuck in some random places on Friday afternoons, and you just you make it work, and like a lot of great experiences along the way.
Yeah, and so now I think it's time we want to hear about Eastwind.
Okay,
you know, what's that process like, starting your own thing from scratch?
Yeah, it's again yet another thing that I couldn't have seen coming, although you could look at it and say, even though I was like resisting my father's pull for years, he was an entrepreneur. He never really, I think he worked at a big firm for 2 weeks, and then he started out on his own and always had his own firm. You know, and I went the other direction and like worked at these big corporations. I had never done anything entrepreneurial in my life. As I think I mentioned, I had been a media banker after Latin America blew up repeatedly in the 90s. I mentioned Mexican peso devalued, Russia defaulted on its debt in 1997. Bear had a big infrastructure, and they decided to restructure the whole thing. I went into the media group at Bear Stearns, and I started covering domestic market. And then along the way, I got interested in this industry in formation, really, education and corporate training. The first internet bubble, 1.0, created opportunity in e-learning. That's what they called it now. Now it's ed tech, and it's a real thing. But at the time, there wasn't really a lot going on. But we started seeing like technology, internet distribution was going to create some big opportunities. I knew enough to know that where there are big problems, there are opportunities, and technology could really help to solve a lot of them. And so I raised my hand right after the dot-com bubble burst and said I would really like to cover this sector. And I think one of the things that was motivating me was an opportunity to do something, work on transactions and be a mercenary investment banker, but do it in a way that was very meaningful and working with companies that were having a positive social impact as well. Took some imagination to see, what the true opportunity was, but raised my hand to start covering it. And then 9/11 happened. It was clear there wasn't going to be an opportunity to build an education franchise at Bear, but yet I wanted to do it. And as a result of working during the dot-com years with more entrepreneurs and venture-backed companies, I really caught the bug. Like I decided that was sort of a stage in the corporate life cycle of companies that resonated with me more, and couldn't do it at Bear, and decided at that point in time Wall Street was going to be a challenging place for a couple of years, and I had been through that, as I mentioned, in the late 80s. And so I thought, I've never done anything entrepreneurial in my life. My father was an entrepreneur effectively, so why don't I try this out? And so we hung up a shingle and set about to see if we could create a firm.
So just what's a brief overview of what Eastwind Advisors does?
What I learned, initially I had been a media and entertainment banker and was interested in education. And I had learned, I'd covered Latin America, so I was like a regional specialist. And then I covered media and entertainment, and I was an industry specialist. And I developed this view, which I think is mostly correct, that as an investment banker, it's really helpful to really focus on an industry as opposed to being a generalist. And there are a number of obvious reasons why. You do one deal in that sector and start building a reputation, and it attracts more business. In any new engagement, you sort of know how to evaluate it, what to do with it, who the relevant players are. And then as you start building a network, it really becomes a virtuous cycle. So I thought that was the right model. At Eastwind, it made sense for Eastwind to be focused on the two sectors that I was interested in. So the first two verticals that we stood up were media and entertainment and education, which has morphed into some sexier labels like ed tech and future of work. So that's the next vertical. And then over the years, we've added consumer, and we've got a couple folks who are trying to figure out healthcare, stand up a franchise in healthcare.
How many employees do you have working for you now?
So we're 20 some odd investment banking professionals.
And how do you attract these people to come work for you?
That is a good question. To this day, I'm not sure. Many of them, or at least at the senior level, come from similar backgrounds. So large firm experience. We've got
Meaning both law and finance, or
no, finance.
Oh, finance.
I think I'm the only one at the firm with the legal experience. But if you took logos of the places that my partners and colleagues have worked at and put it on a slide, you'd see Bear Stearns, you'd see Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, UBS, JP Morgan.
Do you take interns?
Two interns?
We do.
Interesting.
Only exceptional ones.
If you listen to this podcast, you're probably pretty exceptional. So maybe hit the apply button.
I would like to see an analysis of who is listening to this. I hear you have a great audience. So our value proposition is we're industry focused. We know a lot about the sectors that we work in. We come from bulge bracket backgrounds and therefore deliver a very high quality of service, but we're flying at a lower altitude and serving really lower middle markets, emerging growth stage companies, but providing a service that's not otherwise available to them because most of the big banks have really, really large minimum fee requirements, and therefore they can't work on the size transactions that we work on. Every once in a while, we'll bump into a big, much bigger firm, a bulge bracket firm. We, periodically may be competing with them for, whatever reason. We sometimes are on the other side of the table from them, but we're not really going after the same type of businesses just because our transactions are smaller. Our, fee requirements are smaller, but our clients get the same level of service because of the experience that the senior folks have and the training that the younger folks have.
Wow, that's really unique. Could you sort of give us an insight into one of maybe your most memorable transactions?
Or maybe the Manischewitz one. I mean, we already mentioned it. They want to hear.
So that one I did not work on, so I'm going to excuse myself from explaining it. Other than it's great to have the beloved brand Manischewitz on the list of tombstones.
Do you now have a lifetime supply of Manischewitz?
That should have been part of the contract.
No, and I will say, and people should know this, it's hard to get Tam Tams at the Young Israel of the West Side.
Are you
serious? To mention that. Yeah, it's
that's disappointing.
Yeah.
This is a staple of New York Jewish culture.
It is, and I don't know. And I was recently in West Yellowstone, and I found a box of Tam Tams on the shelf.
And you're like, what is this doing here?
I would never in a million years guess that West Yellowstone would have more.
I don't know what West Yellowstone is, to be honest with you.
It's a distance from here, let's say. Anyway, no, it's you can't get Tam Tams every once in a while, but there is a bit of a mystery going on.
So take us maybe into one of the most memorable.
So, well, I will say when I was at Bear, I worked on the IPO of what was then the WWF, but is now the WWE.
That's cool.
Whoa.
And I worked on that with John Waldron, who's now the number 2 at Goldman Sachs, who was a banker at Bear Stearns earlier in his career.
I thought when you said John, you were going to go with John Cena, the WWE star.
I think this preceded him.
I don't think John Cena
was
giving.
The Rock was
The Rock
big
is
in
still
those
there.
days.
Okay, fine.
But that was memorable in a lot of ways, and I won't get into it. But also, when I looked at that transaction, it really prompted me to start thinking about who else is out there that I could work with that's having a different type of impact in the economy in the world. And I will say, I would love to talk about all the companies that we've worked with over the years and the impact that they've had, especially in the education area. And it's incredibly rewarding to work in finance and investment banking, but dedicate a big chunk of my time helping, supporting, advising companies that are really focused on mission and having a strong impact. There's so many, obviously have worked on a number of transactions and would have to think about one that stands out. Maybe recency bias. I can talk about one of the more recent transactions that we closed just to provide a sense for the types of things that we do at the firm.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
So this is a education technology business, actually based in Dublin, Ireland, which led me to have my first trip to Dublin. I've traveled a lot, but somehow never got to Ireland, and so it was great to be there to meet with a client. And it's a company that's called Soapbox Labs, and spent a lot of time in the R&D lab creating a speech recognition technology using LLMs, but other AI, but trained on young kids. And so if you think about the possibility of bringing voice technology into classroom to facilitate learning, you can't really bring Alexa in or Siri in because they're trained on adults, and kids, mispronounce words, speak with lisps, sometimes they're unintelligible. And so those technologies trained on adults aren't really as effective, and you need a high level of accuracy to get the kind of efficacy and outcomes that you would want. And so this particular company was trained exclusively on kids and had like a very significant data set. I'm smiling.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So anyway,
he's thinking about no more teachers in the classroom.
yeah. Well, we could talk about that. There was a really interesting. You guys know Mosaic magazine?
I've heard of it. What could you maybe tell our listeners?
So yeah, it's I think it's like a media property of teshuvah, and and they have a great magazine which I encourage you to look up right after I leave here today.
That's your homework.
teshuvah has great podcasts, but Mosaic wrote recently a long article about the failure of ed tech in the classrooms, and I've been trying to find time to write a rebuttal for that. But anyway, teachers are central to everything that we do, and like we have to think about technology as helping to extend teachers. Maybe it gives them more time to focus on kids who like have different needs. It helps gifted kids who are maybe ahead of everyone sort of learn more independently while teachers are focused elsewhere. So sure, there are misuses, but in this particular case, this company, which was venture backed and had a business model where they were licensing it into bigger curriculum publishers who would embed the technology and use it in their products. And ultimately, after pursuing some financing transactions and having some M&A discussions, we helped them attract interest from a very large and successful curriculum publisher called Curriculum Associates, which itself is backed by 3 private equity firms, Hellman and Friedman, Berkshire, and Primera. And they ended up acquiring the company, and they reached 12 million students in the K-12 ecosystem here in the States. And they're taking this technology and embedding it in all their products to unlock this, voice technology so that young kids, maybe, who aren't going to spend a lot of time or shouldn't spend a lot of time on their computers are able to engage with, or typing on their computers are able to engage in learning, but facilitated by speech recognition.
What are some of the lessons you've learned from all of these transactions and in this whole journey, this process of starting your firm?
One, there's no such thing as an easy deal. There are a few exceptions over the years, but in general, like you got to expect, and I always tell clients, like, they're expressing a lot of interest. This seems like it's going to go down in a very easy way. Mark my words, there will be a point in time, at least one, where you want to pull your hair out, and perhaps punch somebody in the face, and we will work through it. That's one. Two, I'd say you can't forget like the human aspect of all of this, and I think it was interesting to go through COVID. I was personally shocked that transactions were closing between buyers and sellers who never met each other. And, we managed to get through that. But I still don't think that that's like the norm for the way people want to do business. And for sure, like the old guard, people like me who really value, this. But even, I've met people who are younger who, I think were raised the right way, who really understand the value of like sitting down, like making the extra trip to meet with somebody. And, especially in M&A or even financing, like it's often competitive and sellers or issuers are trying to develop relationships with buyers and investors. And buyers and investors may be competing with others and they need to, distinguish themselves from the pack. And there's nothing like figuring out a way to get together, sit down in a room, if there are problems, get together, work them out. So I think the human touch and understanding that like, these transactions, they're not just like financial engineering exercises, like there are humans behind all of this. The way things are presented are important. The way you tell stories are important because at the end of the day, human beings are ingesting them and figuring out what to do with them. So I think the human aspect of it, the psychological aspect of it is critical. And then the last thing I'll say is, especially in our industry, you learn so much from exposure to people who have more experience. You don't get that on Zoom. If you haven't heard Jamie Dimon,
back to work.
Leaked, yeah. And when we decided at our firm, we came back to the office pretty quickly. I was back in the office because I lived close to the office and I rode my bike in and, was there alone for the first few months. And then, some people started coming back, some of the more senior people. It
must have been cool, just in that empty office by yourself.
It was, but, but I also understood that younger people weren't getting the kind of exposure that they would. And for them, as much as anything else, like it was important to get people back in. So reopened quickly, we were somewhat flexible, although probably not as much as some, but we initially gave Monday and Friday as optional. And then Monday, we cut out that optionality. And so we were Friday optional for a while. And then, that Jamie Dimon audio track was leaked and had a big impact on us and me in particular. And so a couple weeks ago in our internal meeting, put the phone down and played the audio track.
Really?
And just said, look, it's not just because we feel like, we need to do it for our clients to really be here because we think we're more productive when we're here, but it's for you guys too. Like, you need to appreciate that, like, being together, this is really an apprenticeship model. And if you're not together, you just miss stuff. And I was proud to see like a lot of head nodding around the conference room table. Like, I think people got it.
People always ask us, like, why don't we do the podcast on Zoom if they can't come in? And I so agree that it's just not the same as being here in person and being able to look someone in the eye and have a conversation. I think it's so much cooler.
Right. Yeah, you guys are old school. I like that.
There we go. We'll take it. Okay, there's a question that we like to close all our podcasts with to our guests. It's a specific skill or experience that you've learned specific within your industry that applies to all other industries. So you could either pick from law or from finance. What would it be? That means it was a good question for.
Oh my goodness.
No, it's just there's so many. But I would say attention to detail. Is that a skill?
Right.
Attention
Yeah,
to detail.
100%.
Yeah. I would say attention to detail is everything. I mean, for sure, like, you need to be articulate, and I think you know how to write. But to be honest, like, people who end up in these fields generally have a certain level of education, so that's not such a big deal. But attention to detail, like, it's something that I actually think you can work on and improve, especially in the investment banking area. Same is true in law. You work in these on these teams that are structured in a way where everyone wants to get leverage from the person beneath them. And if you can get leverage from the person beneath them, then you could go on and do other things and be more productive. And what that means is, if I'm an associate in an investment bank and the analyst is giving me a model to review, and I look at that model and I start seeing all of these errors, I'm not going to be able to just, like, I want to get to the point where you hand me the model, I glance at it, I know your work ethic, I know you have attention to detail, there's probably nothing wrong here. I spend, limited amount of time and pass it up the food chain. But if I can't rely on that, and so on and so forth, I'm working, a vice president is working for me, and he's, he or she is running the deal, and I'm being pulled in because I'm just focused on business development to this meeting where, I'm expected to know everything that's going on and the structure of the deal. And so, I need him or her to explain to me exactly what has happened, because at the end of the day, it's my client, and, the buck stops with me. If, he or she missed, like, the most important issue or a meaningful issue, and all of it comes down to attention to detail, to, like, and I think related to that is preparation. Like, you guys seem like incredibly well prepared. You told me the topics you wanted to talk about. I think for the most part, we've stuck to them. But, just preparation. And I know you want to talk a little bit, or we're probably wrapping up, but just your question around, like, how to prepare for an interview and distinguish yourself. Like, I think it's attention to detail, preparation, putting in some extra time to, like, know who you're talking to, and, trying to, like, figure out something that you could say that'll distinguish you from everybody else, that reflects, like, a real knowledge of who they are and who their firm is.
That's incredible advice for everyone listening, every college student listening, just how much everyone depends on you. You see yourself as low down, you're doing, maybe basic Excel work, basic PowerPoint work. Really, the partners are depending on you as well. It's good chizuk.
Well said.
And do you have any final takeaways, Josh, as a Jewish professional in the workplace?
I would just say, now more than ever, to wear your Judaism with pride in the workplace. And I just think everything that we're doing out there, is an opportunity for a Kiddush Hashem. I feel fortunate that, we had the insight to really commit ourselves to Torah observant lifestyle. And it's not always easy to, have clients coming into town and figure out, like, how to handle, the meals, but you work it out. And for the most part, everybody, like, appreciates hearing about somebody who has this spiritual commitment. And if they don't appreciate it, probably don't want to spend a lot of time with them anyway.
Right.
just being proud with what you and being comfortable with who you are and what you do.
And also understanding, like, we have a community here. It's sort of like a built-in network, and I can't tell you how productive the community is for people who are working in this profession. You know, people are helping out. You know, people have a natural affinity for each other, want to, look for opportunities to work together. It's this built-in,
family.
Really beneficial ecosystem. You go to, another country, another city, another country or whatever, you know that you've got like friends and almost family. You've never met them, but you'll sit at their Shabbat table, and by the time the lunch or dinner is over, like, not only do you have friends, but you also have potential business partners as well. So it's an incredible advantage, and I would just encourage everybody who goes into. One thing that I didn't know early on that I learned now is the importance of networking. Not just for transactional purposes, it's just beneficial to do it, and it opens up so many different options. And we've got this like existing network that can be leveraged, and I just encourage everybody to do that. When you work at a big firm, like, the business comes in, and you don't have to work that hard for it. So when I was at Bear, I was lucky that, on the one hand, like, there was business to transact, but the firm attracted it. It was only when I went out on my own and I realized, nobody knew who my firm was. I needed to go out and hustle. And that's when I learned, I really didn't know how to be an investment banker until, hopefully I did learn along the way. Well, the jury's still out, but
I think so.
Thank you.
It seems like you're doing a pretty good job.
Anyway, but it's only, and I think the earlier you can like not rely on the firm name, right? Because somebody else built that firm. Like, I was at Bear Stearns, I think it celebrated its 75th anniversary. Like, Cy Lewis and Alan and Ace Greenberg and Alan Schwartz and others, they built the firm to what it was.
What it was, past tense.
Yeah, and it's sad. It's really sad. But somebody else built that. Like, even if you're fortunate enough to work at those firms, and if anybody has an opportunity to work at a big firm, I recommend that they do it. It's a great place to learn the trade. Then you have to figure out whether you want to continue in that direction or go in the more boutique path. But I'll just say, like, even if you're working at a big firm and the business comes in over the transom, like, develop those skills, because you never know where you're going to end up. And, It took me leaving to, figure out how to originate business.
Okay. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
What a pleasure.
We'll see you at Shabbos.
We'll
at the
see you
Shabbos
at
lunch.
hopefully at the Shabbos
We're
table.
going to schedule it right after you turn record
There we go. Thank you to all our listeners. You guys really are the ones that drive the podcast. Thank you to Josh. Thank you to Ashley. Thank you to Jonathan. And of course, thank you to JB for setting up the room. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll hopefully see you on the next one.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.